I'm going to sit next to you, and I can also cozy and open.
Her name is Bose.
All right, so I'm going to invite you guys to
Somebody sit up front.
Yeah, right. And yes, we have
One more car.
Where's the way? Sit next to you.
Thank you guys for coming.
You could say anyway.
This is Gus. Gus is the king of the Peterborough Players.
The keys.
Lisa Bossler is the queen of the Peterborough Players in the New York stage.
There you go. And the world.
And the world, really. And I'm indebted to Gus and to Lisa, who are performing tonight in the Doll's House Part 2 at the Peterborough Players. Shameless prompt for them. But also just, it's enormously generous of them to come and read for an hour and a half before they perform. So I super thank them. I super thank the, how should we say, the musical ensemble, who is so good that they can pull it all together 30 seconds before they do it. So thank you very much. So Jody Simpson is here singing, and JoJo Meade, and Kyle, and Duncan, and I'm sorry, I don't realize anyway, who else is singing? And Mary Beth Howland, of course. So we're just like have super amazing voices in the room. So I just want to say a couple of words before Gus and Lisa start. I'm kind of stalling, so Kathy doesn't feel bad. She's going really good. So what I would say is, though, at the end of the so Gus is going to read the first story, and Lisa will do some voicing in that story, and then Lisa will do and the story that Gus is reading is actually the third story in the collection, and then Lisa's going to read the final story, which brings it all together, and that's where the music happens at the very end. Anyone in the very end, after the sort of reading is complete, and when the people who sing for the second time, not the first. If you are so moved, you are welcome to sing or hum along. Really, I don't need to say, I think, much more about it. Hopefully you'll...
Introduce the book.
Okay. This is the book.
Oh, yeah.
My publisher would like you to know that it is we're making a video, so I'm needing to really... So, this lovely volume of stories.
Please don't be facetious.
So anyway, this is the book, and it's a collection of linked short stories that take place in a traveling carnival in the Jim Crow South circa 1910 to 1930. And the reason that it says unfolding stories of redemption and belonging is that that's what the stories are. So anyway, I'm not going to say any more. We'll make videotape later if we need to. We're just going to let these beautiful people read. Thank you for.
Thank you.
Oh, there won't be a break between the two stories so that these guys can get to work tonight. So after the two stories, then there'll be refreshments, and hopefully, if any of you can stay, and I'm hoping some of you can, just the last thing I want to say is, part of the reading isn't just so you hear the words, it's that those of you, you're a curated audience. So I invited people who are conversant in art and dance and music and theater, because what I'm really hoping happens with this book is that it really takes flight into performance in multiple ways, and I really am hoping it takes place internationally, that it isn't just like what we do in the Monadnock region. I'm hoping what you folks in the Monadnock region do is help me to give it legs and envision how it might be done. So if you would, as you listen, be thinking about performatively, how might you translate the metaphors that I've laid on this page into three-dimensional art movement.
And kindly silence anything that makes a noise.
Yes, and if you have a biological need that's, elimination, there's a bathroom around the corner, and it's a pocket door, so it pulls. You don't have to be part of the performance. Please pull.
Lee, you want to sit down?
Sure. Yeah.
Where are you actually starting in the book? Is it right at the beginning?
No, it's the third story.
Lizard Man. The first sign that he was different came as a baby, when Julian Henry's mother could not cure his unrelenting rash. But that he didn't notice until later. Initially, he remembered wondering what was in her cup. The mysterious substance looked like dirt. He kept pointing his 2-year-old finger, a lazy way to express his curiosity, but his mother, Alice, took it as a sign. She had not been particularly religious before her son's birth. a quiet Presbyterian. But after the first year of trying ointments and remedies with no relief for her baby's scaly skin, she began wondering if he had been cursed. The doctor in town diagnosed him. Ichthyosis. Unsightly. Not contagious, no known cure. Alice's sister mentioned the biblical precedent of skin lesions signaling spiritual impurity, though Alice preferred to dwell on Jesus, who healed the lepers, thus suggesting that Julian, because of his suffering, had a special in with the Lord. That set the stage for the miraculous discovery that he had been sent as an emissary to deliver God's word on earth.
Sacrifice.
She heard him whisper as she peered at the grounds in her cup. Give up your worldly pleasure that you might better serve your Lord. She gazed at Julian, his arm raised, and realized that she had given birth to after all. She had not been punished, no. She'd been divinely chosen. Jesus knew she would understand Julian's powers, whereas others, like Julian's father, with his repulsion to the boy's skin, would completely miss his special gifts. But God knew Alice Henry would see beyond the surface, to look deep within her child's soul. She passed the test of faith. He sent her sister to fool her, tempt her to turn her from her own son. But she alone stood with him, casting no aspersions, never surrendering to doubt. As she poured the coffee down the drain, her voice crested along the words,
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Julian toddled behind her, finally mustering the energy to say, What's in your cup, Mama? But in her reverie, Alice did not hear. When she first sewed wings made of white felt to his romper, Julian felt special. His mother spent an entire day fitting him, positioning the wings and brushing his hair. When his father arrived home that night, eyeing the outfit, the words fell sharply, the edges scraping Julian, even if the meaning landed as a dull thud. You can dress him any way you please, but he's still going to have that hideous skin. His mother shrieked and brought her hand to her mouth.
How dare you speak that way in front of him? Colin, you're awful. He's a child of the Lord.
She didn't dare tell him of Julian's powers. Her husband scoffed at religion more times than not, a sign of his own impure heart, no doubt. He claimed his revulsion came from memories of his aunt with psoriasis. The vision of her arm, drooping with skin, the flakes sifting into his oatmeal bowl, lost in the mush before he could scoop them out, still haunted him. How he, of all people, could have fathered a son whose scales never faded, convinced Colin Henry that either God was a cruel bastard or a fake. Young Julian sensed his father's disgust. When he ran towards him, Colin turned away. Suddenly he had to fetch a tool or check something outside, but he never invited Julian to come. Alice, aware of her husband's discomfort, tried all the more to assure Julian that he alone inherited God's special gift. She filled the hours of her husband's absence with Bible study. Every morning she read to Julian. Sitting in his mother's lap, being cuddled was alluring enough, but when he began to listen to the curves in his mother's voice, the stories unfolded. By the time he was 4, Julian remembered most of the characters she'd introduced him to, and Alice began teaching him to read. She printed one word on a card, pointed to its corresponding object, a chair, a bowl, her dress. Julian matched the sounds with pictures and then progressed to assigning the proper configuration of letters to the characters she drew. Abraham. The name made him giggle, but Alice used her strongest voice as she sketched the patriarch.
Abraham trusted the Lord the way I trust you. God spoke directly to him, just like God speaks to you.
Her tone softened as she spoke. Abraham, he repeated, the father of Isaac. The lessons became more arduous. The more he absorbed, the more convinced Alice was of his powers. But she decided to debut them at a church other than her own, just in case they were met with skepticism. Shortly after Julian turned 4, she dressed him in his angel outfit and took him to a revival meeting at a Pentecostal church on the edge of town. Greeted by the congregants upon their arrival, Alice was quick to tell of her son's prophetic gifts. The women clumped at the door, peered at the small boy with wings on his back, their gaze moving across the patchy face. Julian watched their eyes travel, the horror tugging at their faces. Someone shrieked.
Only one so tormented in the flesh,
His mother told them.
could be so divine in the soul.
Taking their cue from her, the women's vision changed. They knelt in front of him, drawing the pastor's attention. What have we here? He asked.
My son is an emissary of the Lord. He's been sent to remind us of the purity of heart. Those like his father look away, but folks who know the Lord and welcome the Spirit of Jesus can see into my son's soul, and he can see into ours. Lord speaks right to him, Pastor.
How can you be sure?
Oh, I've waited, asked God for a sign. Julian took to the Bible like a crow to bread, hungering for the words his heavenly Father wrought.
Come here, son. The pastor reached out his arm to Julian. Julian, who had never been welcomed into his father's arm, could scarcely believe any man beckoned him. He inched toward the stranger, whose face seemed longer than any he'd seen. Julian noticed the yellow teeth, the tiny pits in the pastor's skin, the starchiness of his breath. And what does God tell you, son? Suddenly the man seemed larger than life. His mother beamed behind him. Julian closed his eyes and wished for words. None came. So he opened them. The long-faced man still filled his view. That lady in the green dress, she's been having trouble. The Lord wants her to know he loves her in spite of sin. Sister Cooper, what's this boy talking about? The pastor looked alarmed. The woman peered so hard at Julian he wanted to cry.
How'd you know? I've been feuding with my sister, Reverend. Done spoke about her behind her back.
Hallelujah, the child is blessed. A large woman whose blue dress rippled as she spoke knelt down and hugged him. Julian caught sight of his mother, hands clasped across her bosom.
Yes, Lord.
She said, her eyes cast upward.
You have blessed my son.
After that, Alice took Julian to her church, where the pastor encouraged her to share the wealth of God's bounty by taking Julian around. By the time he turned 5 and could recite verses with little prompting, they had visited a dozen church meetings and 2 revivals. At the market, when townspeople recognized him, he cringed while she smiled with self-satisfaction. In his outfit, he always drew attention. People staring frightened him, but as they drew near, his mother would whisper,
Listen to Jesus. He'll tell you what to say.
a breath warm in his ear, the crowd gathering expectantly. He began studying their faces. Sometimes older boys or drifters would hurl suspicion or even contempt. Take the little bastard home, a man hollered near the courthouse.
Shut up, you old drunk.
A woman responded, though the man did not even look as old as his father. His mother never asked if he wanted to wear the costume or ride the streetcar downtown. She simply began each day with Bible verses and a story, and then told him that, like their Savior Jesus, he had his own crown of thorns. He liked the words he learned from the Bible, their weight on his tongue, and he liked the pennies and nickels women pressed into his palm as they bent over, their eyes burning holes in him. But on the days he saw other children, he wondered what their lives were like. What did ordinary boys do with their mothers all day? At night, after they returned home, before his father left for work at 10, Julian would sit patiently at the table waiting for his father to ask him about his day. He spent as little time around the boy as possible, printing newspapers far into the night, sleeping deep into the day. Unlike his wife, he found nothing symbolic or spiritual about his son. The scales simply reminded him of his aunt and her perpetually flaking skin. Julian knew better than to reach for his father, who would nod to him as if hoisting some reluctant load. His earliest memories were of his father's hands large on his torso, holding him at bay. Julian wondered how his father's embrace would feel. Would he hug harder than his mother did? How would the calloused fingers feel? Because of his skin, he preferred the currency of pressure, squeezes, firm grips, bear hugs, to the caresses and light touch of his mother that his mother usually offered him. No matter how many conversations he overheard where his mother urged his father to hug him, to lift him onto his shoulders or carry him to bed, his father refused. If Julian approached him fully clothed, his father might allow him to sit on his lap, balanced precariously on his knee. But the few times Julian tried to snuggle, to let his weight fall into his father's belly and chest, his father quickly shifted him and held him upright. After a while, Julian simply skirted his father's chair. In the morning, on the way to the kitchen, where his mother conducted their daily Bible study, Julian paused by the door to his parents' bedroom, listening to his father breathe. He found the raspy sound somehow reassuring. Ear pressed to the door, he imagined slipping under the covers, tucking himself between his father's arms. As he got older, the lessons got harder. There were no pictures for though, or thou, or begot. He grew restless, longing for other activities. He wondered what other children did.
They go to school.
His mother explained. What's that?
It's a place where ordinary children go to learn their numbers and words.
How come I can't go there too?
Because you are special. Not like any other little boy. You alone have been chosen as a messenger of God.
He couldn't quite imagine a school, but he wished for the chance to go just the same. His father didn't raise the subject of school with him, but one evening, before his father left for work, he handed Julian the paper and asked him to read. Julian tried. He had learned to sound out words, though the ones in the newspaper felt different. He had no pictures to go along with them. I want you to practice reading this every day, you understand? There's more to read than just the Bible. If your mother's going to keep you home, then you need to read everything you can so the world doesn't pass you by. If there's a word you don't know, you ask. Understand? What Julian understood was this was a way to reach his father. Every afternoon, while his mother straightened the house and prepared for dinner, Julian scoured the newspaper, circling unfamiliar words with a red pen his father had brought home from work. Then, when his father got up, Julian presented the list of words. Slowly, a world blossomed before him, of inventions and revolutions, uprisings and strikes. A world so far removed it was hard to believe, harder than the one laid out 2,000 years before. But what mattered most in those moments of discovery was the steady breathing of his father by his side, the way his father's hands moved through the air, and sometimes, inadvertently, landed on his shoulder. Alice noticed her husband's interest, worried it would distract Julian from the message of Jesus. The more Julian read the newspaper, the more he wanted his father to take him where other boys went, ball games, parades, county fairs. Finally, one Sunday, after Julian had returned from church with his mother, he asked his father if they could go to a baseball game. He watched his father waiting for his answer, aching for an outing suitable for a boy without scales or wings. The next Saturday, before they went to see a local team play, his father handed him a cap, insisted he dress warmly. Julian sat perspiring in his long-sleeved shirt and trousers, noticing the boys in their short pants and the men with their sleeves rolled up. Though he felt foolish sweating into his clothes, he relished the hour next to his father in the bleachers. It was the first time he had seen his father outside of the house, cheering, hollering, waving like other men. It wasn't until halfway through the third inning, when Julian whispered to his father that he had to pee, that the boy behind them pointed and said, "Look at him, Daddy, he's got funny skin." Julian had heard comments before, but his father, who had taken him nowhere, retreated from the words. "Come on," he said, ushering him away. His mother would have said,
Mind your manners, sonny. My boy is blessed by the Lord.
but all his father could do was escort him from the bleachers. After he'd relieved himself, he inhaled the smell of peanuts, listening for the sound of the ball flying from the bat. His father asked, "Have you got a feel for the game?" Julian nodded. "All right then." His father's hand on his shoulder, and he led him out. There'll be others, but there were not. Though it spared him having to face his father's embarrassment, he longed for an outing without his mother, when no one praised his powers or noticed his skin. When she took him out, she gloated, deepening the pain of his father's shame even more. In the afternoon, his father still read with him, but the world shrank. All the stories his father had printed disappeared. The letters growing so small, Julian could barely read them. The events on those pages existed somewhere else, in a place he could not find, where neither parent could take him. The walls of his house grew tighter. The aisles of the churches grew so narrow he could hardly move. He begged Jesus to free him, to part the waters like God had done for Moses, and let him escape. In the bathtub, he submerged his head, holding his breath for as long as he could, until his reflexes sent him upward, gobbling for air. He began to notice what other children were doing when he and his mother went into town. Children trying on shoes or buying candies, their hands clutching pennies they offered an adult they could barely see behind the counter. Brothers and sisters restless in their Sunday clothes, and older boys running full steam towards the trolley, coattails flying in their own self-created breeze. And there he stood, on the corner of Park and Monroe, draped in white flannel, with small wings attached, his mother laying claim to the miracle she created. At night he began to dream of running away, peeling off the angel suit and chasing after the big boys, embarrassed in his underdrawers, but running so fast no one could tell. He would hop on the streetcar and beg the boys to take him away. As he lay there imagining his escape, his mother slipped in, sat next to him on the edge of the bed, reassuring him it was better to be paid attention to for one's virtues rather than for one's flaws. God, in his infinite wisdom, had found a way to bless him, and she had been keen enough to recognize it. But as she kissed his brow, he furrowed it, anxious to have her leave. As soon as she rose and pulled the door behind her, the emptiness expanded like a balloon, enlarging until it popped. And that's when he realized, without her, he would feel like the only person on earth. The morning Julian turned 7, he woke to his mother's touch, her hand grazing his forehead, then nudging his shoulder.
Wake up, sleepyhead. I got a surprise for you.
She cooed. Sleep still crowded his head as he squeezed his eyelids against the light, then opened them. The sunlight framed his mother, her eyes dancing, arms extended.
Come, let's see what the birthday boy got.
A new toy? Maybe a bike he could ride far away into the Wild West, where he would disappear into the hills, leaving all the grief-stricken ladies on street corners who waited for his heavenly pronouncements. The hallway grew shorter with each step.
Look in the kitchen.
His mother instructed. As he neared it, he could hear scratching. In the corner by the stove sat a large box with a blue ribbon wrapped around it. The scratching intensified. Julian rushed over. At last, an animal, something to rescue him. When he opened the box, out popped a black cocker spaniel puppy, its nose prodding Julian's fingers, its soft tongue licking his face. Julian ran his lips across the silky ears of the dog, the softness sending water to his eyes. The dog's tongue traveled across his face and hands, and they each lapped up sensations new to them. He named the dog Jessie as he carried the water bowl from the sink, walking slowly so as not to spill, setting it beside the food his mother placed on the floor. Julian stroked the dog's back as it drank the water and sniffed the food. The rest of the day he did not let Jessie out of his sight. With no other children to come celebrate, the pup alone denoted the changing year, tail wagging wildly, a trail of pee rolling off the paper, puddling on the floor. That night Jessie curled next to Julian on the bed. Though the waters had not parted, for the first time in his life, Julian thanked Jesus anyway. The second time came 4 years later, when Jack Reynolds paid a call. Jessie jumped on his gabardine trousers, leaving dusty paw prints as the tall, sandy-haired man shooed him away. When the man introduced himself as the manager of Kimball's Traveling Emporium, Julian watched his mother's face tighten like a sphincter, unwilling to let anything pass. She had seen the sideshow at the circus once as a child and stood resolute that her son would not become a traveling oddity. Jack Reynolds did his best to explain that they would provide a bigger and better format to showcase her son's powers. Why confine his audience to one town when he could join their circuit and visit 30 towns a year? No doubt the Lord had sent him to do justice to such a miraculous child. It would be downright selfish to keep the boy at home when thousands could be touched by his grace. And how could a God-loving woman such as herself not answer the Lord's call when her son had been doing it for years? Julian listened to the first person he ever heard out-talk his mother, wondering if Jesus had finally sent someone who might rescue him. The only problem Jack Reynolds faced after he convinced Alice to let Julian join up was keeping her home. She wanted to come along as Julian's manager, to assure that he would not be billed as a child with unusual skin. He was to be presented as a messenger from God, an earthly angel. Jack promised he would personally oversee Julian's act. While she was welcome to attend the show free of charge at any time, Jack Reynolds explained that parents were not allowed to chaperone their children. He assured her they would provide companionship and Christian supervision. As Reynolds talked, Julian watched his father, hand wrapped around his chin, listening. As soon as Reynolds paused to breathe, his father spoke up, offering no opposition to his son seeing more of the world than churches and revival tents, but he expected his wife to stay home. She brooded.
If he's part of some spectacle full of others, he's apt to be overlooked. We're not talking a simple talent like dancing or singing. Julian here might be the only person alive known to communicate directly with the Lord.
She rubbed her hands on the side of her apron as Julian stood behind her and watched, praying the man would think of the right words to say. Ma'am, I can assure you that every man, woman, and child that encounters your boy will know they have seen an angel of God. We'll make postcards for folks to purchase so they can commemorate the very moment they laid eyes on a child so blessed as yours. No doubt Mr. Henry will be printing up some stories about the show in the newspaper. I can guarantee you folks will know you sent them this special little messenger of the Lord. His mother told Jack Reynolds to wait right there while she spoke to Julian and his father in the other room. You want to do this, son? His father asked, leaning in close. Because if you do, it might be a real good idea, getting out and seeing things. After waiting his whole life for Jesus to actually speak to him, Julian Henry accepted the call. Yes, Papa, I'd like to go. Instantly, his mother's eyes watered. I'll be fine, Mama. Remember, my wings are the arms of Jesus carrying me. She sniffled and hugged him, so tight he felt submerged in the bathtub. She packed a bag with the largest of his angel suits, pajamas, and 2 sets of ordinary clothes. As she wiped a washcloth over his face and around the soft cartilage of his ears, it occurred to him that no one had mentioned whether he could bring Jessie. Julian pushed his mother's hand away, and he ran back into the parlor where Jack Reynolds sat with his father discussing the printing press. The dog, sir. I have to bring the dog, otherwise I won't go. My son, his father interjected, I'm sure Mr. Reynolds here can't be concerned about the whereabouts of your dog. I'm afraid the road is no place for a pup. You'll get to see other animals, though. Julian stood firm, hoping Jesus was listening. I'm sorry, sir, but I need my dog. Much as he wanted to escape his life, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving Jessie behind. He could just see his mother, hunched over her sewing machine, making the dog his own tiny wings. Jack Reynolds ran his tongue over his front teeth and made a sucking sound. He breathed out his consternation and then said, Don't you think your dog will be happier at home? Julian rattled his head so hard the man consented, but only on a trial basis. If it don't work out, we're going to have to send him back. You understand, son? Yes, sir, Julian answered, convinced for the first time in his life that God had come to save him. His mother cried as Jack Reynolds walked him to the door.
Dear Lord, look after my boy.
She whimpered. She mouthed Bible verses as Julian led Jesse on his leash, Mr. Reynolds carrying the dog's box and Julian's bag. When they reached Reynolds' car, his father said, I love you, and patted his head. He arrived at the Emporium and quickly learned the talker would tell folks about his amazing powers. And for an extra dime, they could speak to him directly and receive a personal message from God. Neither Jack Reynolds nor the owner, Charles Kimball, cared how Julian derived the message each paying customer needed to hear. You're on speaking terms with Jesus, so just ask him, Jack suggested the morning of his first show. He stood on a stage with a man wrapped with serpents, which gave Julian the willies. He decided anyone familiar with snakes might just be in cahoots with the devil. So he asked Mr. Reynolds if he could stand at the far end of the stage next to a pair of children with sloped faces and pointy heads. The first night, he leaned over his cot and stroked Jesse's silky fur, the weight of aloneness settling in his chest. The two pointy-headed children and the girl with no arms shared the trailer. As they drifted off to sleep, Paco and Arroyo nattered their words, just sounds that swelled and crested into wriggling rhythms that reminded Julian of birds. Lisa, the armless girl, snored as he lay in the dark petting Jesse, half frightened and half relieved. He had never slept near strangers nor been around so many people who did not stare. He thought of asking Lisa to play marbles until he caught the thought in midair. Suddenly he felt silly lying there among other children so obviously deformed that they did not have to pretend to be anything other than the oddities they were. He minded his manners and surveyed the other performers the first few days, searching for someone he could play with or even talk to, but no one expressed much interest. The others spoke to him, usually to inquire where he was from, but like Lisa, who demonstrated great dexterity with her feet, playing on her miniature piano, they declined to shoot marbles. The pointy head swallowed 2 of his marbles, before Lisa warned him to keep the shiny balls out of Paco and Arroyo's sight. At night, he lay awake, thinking of questions he could ask the men who surrounded him. All the news his father had told him came tumbling into his head. He knew about the women who wanted to vote, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and all the deaths from Pellagra, even before the traveling Emporium canceled their tour of South Carolina, the year so many people died there. In the dark, with his hand resting on Jesse's ribcage as it rose and fell, Julian practiced questions he could ask. Lisa's snoring became a purr as the questions swirled in his head. He slid into sleep, dreaming of the muscle man, hoisting him onto his massive shoulders, hands gripped tight around Julian's ankles, the meaty fingers clutching with no notice of the patchy scales beneath. At breakfast, he circled around the questions hovering in his head. He spotted Freddie, stripped of his knives, dressed only in his balloony pants and a white undershirt, hands flying wildly as he shared a story with Alex, the fire eater. Julian waited there on the bench, saving room for Freddie to join him. Eggs growing cold, Julian followed Freddie's trail over to the chow line, so intent on tracing Freddie's movement, Julian failed to notice Toby, the human pincushion, approaching from behind, his spidery leg looping over the bench. How's it going, kid? He asked as he set down his tray. No, wait, Julian wanted to scream. Not you. That seat's for Freddie, a man with a skill, not some pathetic lout who makes his living piercing himself. But it was too late. Toby's words fell like droppings on Julian's plate. Freddie looked over, indicating toward Julian with his head. From Freddie's look, Julian could tell he had become fodder of their conversation. When Freddie and Alex passed in front of him to sit at another table, he pulled in his head. Hey, Turtle Boy, great story. Ought to join those tent stompers like crazy, now that we got a little angel in the show. Julian tried hard to read the inflection, his eyes straining against the angle of his dropped head. It wasn't revulsion he heard, just insignificance, a good ruse, the butt of a joke, nothing more. Julian pushed against the human pincushion and yanked his tray. You gonna eat those grits? Toby asked him. No, and neither are you, he said, lifting the plate from the tray and letting the contents slide onto the ground. He could feel the tears welling, his eyes burning, a knot rising in his throat. He'd not realized how accustomed he'd grown to the looks from ladies who had congregated around him back home, sucking in their breath like pity caught on a nail. His mother's stories about him had spread like mint, overtaking the last seedlings of truth as the women began to cluck and pray. He had tried to hear God searching frantically for the Lord's will in these women's eyes. as their disbelief transformed into faith. But he'd never heard the messages, and now it seemed no one heard him. He sprinted back to the trailer, his breath hammering his chest, fists clenched, arms moving like pawls. He burst through the door, half expecting to find Paco and Arroyo or Lisa still there, but no voices called out. He stood caught in the grip of his own fear, clenching his fists so that his fingernails pressed into his palms. The words, "Who am I?" crawled across his brain. Slow as a dirge, he lifted one foot and then the other until he stood before the mirror on the wall. He studied the face as if he were inspecting an unfamiliar insect, noticing the shape of his eyebrows, the angle of his nose, slightly upturned, the breadth of his lips, which reminded him of a slice of pear, a sliver of smoothness amidst the otherwise scaled terrain. For a moment he looked past the scales, but then, just as quickly, they returned to his view. He shut one eyelid at a time so he could see whether the crescent above the eye crackled the way the rest of them did. He turned his head as if the slightest movement might be his last. Nothing but the still heat of morning. He edged his way to the door and latched it before returning to the mirror. The shades drawn against the heat, he pulled off his undershirt and unfastened his shorts, letting them fall. Slipping his thumbs between his skin and the waistband of his underpants, he peeled them off, absorbing the sight of his own flesh dangling there. He twisted round to inspect the scales on his rear end, roughly about the same shape and size as the keys on the typewriter in Mr. Kimball's office, but without a purpose. No crisp letters to correspond with his keys, only the false whisperings of Jesus. Only his mother had asked him what he really heard. He remembered when he was 5, the lady at the corner of Brighton and Elm, who had asked him whether her no-good scoundrel of a husband would be back. The sound of the word scoundrel tickled him, though he had no idea what it meant. So he had shut his eyes and tried to imagine it. Pictures of tall waves came to him. "No, ma'am," he answered. "He's out to sea." Her eyes had filled up with tears so quickly, he added, "But Jesus will heal your heart." So she hugged him anyway. His mother had no way of feeling the terror he felt inside. He pulled up his underpants and shorts, notching his belt extra tight. Arms poking through the sleeves of his shirt, he popped his head through and growled, "Ain't nothing but a boy with ugly-ass skin, and don't none of them fellows want to know you. That bony man in Decatur's the only one knelt down to give you a hug. You better hope that poor man's little girl didn't die." He watched his own lips separate around the vowels punched with all the venom he could muster. Jessie barked in the corner. "Shut up!" Julian barked back. He grabbed the dog's collar. Jessie began licking him. "What are you licking me for? You just do it because you don't know any better. Damn fool! You and my mama!" He dragged the dog across the floor. "Out you go! Get you some air!" On his 12th birthday, Julian looked over the line of people approaching him. At the back of the tent, he thought he saw someone wave. He blinked to focus. The upraised palm remained in view. He followed the length of the arm to the shoulder, where the chest and neck got lost behind a tall man with a hat. But the hand stayed there. The woman directly in front of him yanked his robe.
"Hey, Sonny, when is the Messiah going to come?"
He quoted Revelations and watched her file past. He looked for the hand again, but it was gone. He found the tall man with the hat, but he could not see beyond. In front of him, a thin, bespectacled man with greasy hair spoke. "And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke into pieces the rocks before the Lord." Julian smiled as he answered, "But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice." "I just love that part, don't you?" the man grunted, and grinned, his short teeth snippets of joy. Once in a while, a viewer saw only a little biblical banter, which came as a great relief. Suddenly, the tall man had shifted to the side, and Julian saw his mother. "Hi, Mama," he whispered, wondering if she would expect him to deliver a message to her from Jesus. Had she come for that?
"Praise God!"
She shouted as she approached. "I got a break at 3. I can talk to you then," he said quietly, as he could. She stepped to the side and let another woman speak to him. He wished she wouldn't watch him, but there was no way he could get her to leave. By the time his break rolled around, she'd watched him offer verses to 3 women and a man carrying his small son. The talker told the patrons to exit quickly, as the show would be closing for 15 minutes, so Julian instructed her to wait for him behind the stage. He hoped none of the other performers had noticed her.
"Why didn't you tell me how vulgar it is?"
She asked as soon as he stepped into earshot.
"Those poor slope-faced children, and that armless girl up there with a snake charmer and the contortionist. Hardly a fitting location for a messenger of God.
Depends on how you look at it. Jerry, the talker for the show, had caught her comment as he passed by. Can you think of any place in need of his message more? Jerry smiled and kept moving.
That's one way to look at it.
She stroked Julian's face.
I missed you something terrible. They treat you all right?
Yes, ma'am, they treat me fine. You come alone?
Your father brought me, but he didn't come in. Doesn't do well in crowds.
She reached in her handbag and pulled out a large envelope.
He wanted you to have this, though, for your birthday.
The envelope didn't fit in his trouser pocket, so he set it on a shelf next to the extra postcards featuring all the performers. I'll look at it later.
I'm sorry I didn't bring you a cake. I have something else.
She pulled a tissue paper wrapped packet from her bag. He peeled the paper away from a tiny gold cross.
I can't believe I never thought to give you one before. Pretty, isn't it? 14 karat gold.
Not a slingshot, not a jackknife, not even a baseball glove. Julian snatched his next breath.
Let me fasten it on you.
She reached around his neck, the thin chain sliding into the crevices between scales.
Doesn't that look
The
nice?
smile expectant as ever. I gotta get ready to go back.
So soon? It's hardly been 5 minutes. How's Jesse? I still can't believe they let him stay.
He's fine. The pointy heads love him.
The sign says they're ancient Aztecs.
I have my doubts.
Doesn't matter anyway. Jesus loves them just the same.
Her eyes welled with tears.
I wish you'd come back home. It's not the same without you.
He looked past his mother in the direction of the tent that housed the girly show. His father was probably waiting there. I gotta go.
You think that talker man would introduce me? Let them see who discovered your gift in the first place?
Now, Mama, you don't want it to sound like you're taking the credit for the miracle. She appeared stunned.
Of course not.
She took his face in her hands and kissed him.
Jesus ever mention what's in store for us? I mean,
Lips tight, brow furrowed, scales rising like frost heaves, he whispered, sacrifice. Then watched her face tighten. He just keeps whispering, sacrifice. That night he opened the envelope and pulled out what looked like a page from the newspaper. The headline read, World's Best Son Thrills Thousands. Below, an article extolled miraculous acts of prognostication. He folded the paper in half, then into quarters, then into eighths, then tucked it in his drawer, where it stayed until the following week in Decatur, when the haggard-looking man filed in front of him, tears running from his eyes. The man knelt before him, his thin hands and bony wrists tied like a knot, wishing itself into a bow. They said she'd heal, got better before she got worse. All I want to know is, did she find her way to Jesus? His dark stone eyes set deep in place, deeper than the night. He squeezed Julian so hard he bent his wings. Yes, sir, for the righteous have entered the kingdom of heaven, and in the Lord's house they dwell. He kept his eyes shut until he felt the man's grip around his ankles loosen. When he opened his eyes, he watched a trail of teary snot drip onto his shoes. Without thinking, he lay his hand on the man's thinning hair. That night, when Julian returned to his trailer, he set fire to the envelope, watching it crackle on the ground, writhing like some pathetic figure, bright orange in the blue-black air. From that point on, when he wasn't on stage at the Emporium, he picked pockets and devised schemes to trip little children or frighten their parents, so no one would ever mistake him as an instrument of God. The gap between his stage persona and his other self widened, as if the earth had split beneath him. Within months, he became utterly mean-spirited and bitter as unsweetened chocolate, his head permanently tucked between his shoulders. His pranks became so vicious that Lisa told the owner. The water over the door and the honey in the bed annoyed her, but the loud bangs and the snakes in her drawer frightened her, and if it were not for Jessie, she feared Julian would light the trailer on fire some night just to see how quickly she and the pointy-headed brothers could get out. Jack Reynolds leaned on the boy, trying to get at why he turned so sour, quicker than cream left out in the sun. I don't want to play no savior. You don't. Angels ain't saviors. Don't you know the difference, boy? I'm not an angel either. Why can't I be a two-legged lizard? He kicked the dirt, sending a tiny cloud of fury across the earth. Look here, son. Your mama told me that ever since you were little, you delivered messages from God. Now that is a bigger draw than alligator skin, and the combination makes it sweeter. Little leper-looking boy speaks God's truth, quotes them verses like he's clean, gives hope to other distorted critters. No, sir, son. We ain't about to yank one of our most popular acts. Shit, Julian sputtered. You can raise all the hell you want when you ain't working, but it won't convince me to change your act. You understand? I hired you, boy, and this is a business. You pull too much, and you won't get hired anywhere else. Talk travels, and showmen got the biggest ears. Now, go on and get ready and keep that dog of yours from crapping near the trailers, or I'll ship his ass out of here. Reynolds gave him a fiery look. Julian cursed him, wishing for the first time since he'd left that he were back home. He saw her coming, thighs rubbing like a cricket, knees slightly bowed, bracelets jangling on her wrists, dark hair bobbing like she owned the road. He sat on top of his trailer, cigarette poised in his lips, watching as she traveled towards him, her eyes darting every which way until they landed on him like great splats of rain.
Well, what have we got here?
She looked him over, squinching her eyes and raising her eyebrows simultaneously. What are you staring at, Shorty? Ain't you ever been to a 10-in-1 show? He felt like spitting, just to keep her from encroaching, but his mouth rattled dry.
They hire you for your poison tongue?
I reckon they would if they hired you on account of your personality,
Not bad.
she said, looking right at him.
I always appreciate a quick wit. I suppose you figured it out already, but I'm tiny. Welcome to Beasley World.
He sat unmoved by her introduction. She exuded none of the frantic need of the women who used to cluster around him, nor did she possess the unassuming charm of Jack Reynolds' wife, Irma, back at Kimball's Traveling Emporium. Thanks, he muttered.
You got those scales on your pecker?
What's it to you? If he'd had a tail, he would have flicked it by now.
Just making conversation, that's all.
Not hired to talk, that's why I came here.
Suit yourself then, lizard.
She winked and strutted off. The name stuck. A handful of other shows had performers with alligator skin, so Earl Beasley liked the variation of Lizard Man. He had the sign painter draw a great green and brown flecked tail coming out of Julian's green satin shorts, and an elongated snout in lieu of a nose. What'd you paint me like that for? Julian asked, shocked at the image unfurled on the Midway. Stan Beasley snorted. To draw folks in. You ever work a sideshow before? 6 years with Kimball's Traveling Emporium. Didn't your brother tell you that? Well, what kind of sign did you have there? I was an angel, supposed to receive messages from the Lord. Didn't want to do that here? No, sir. I signed an agreement with you folks. I don't do nothing but get stared at on account of my scaly-ass skin. I'll be out of here tonight if anybody tries something different. Julian popped in his head and clenched his fist. Personally, I don't cotton to that picture. Flipper Boy sits on the pool all day like he's part seal, so of course we're going to draw you with a tail. Don't be stupid on us, lizard. After all them years in the business, you know the same as I do. It's all in the presentation. Stan backed away as if he'd stepped in dog shit. Besides, he continued, half smirking, everybody's prettier on the sign. At least at Beasley's, he got his own trailer. But with Jessie dying that last summer at Kimball's, the nocturnal emptiness circled like flames licking stone. He almost asked if he could bunk in with the strong man or Anders, the sword swallower, but he couldn't bear the thought that either would reject him, so he endured the long nights alone, watching the others form attachments or set off to visit the whores in town. The only comfort came during the fraternity of waking hours. Here the other performers no longer viewed him as a child, so they offered cigarettes and liquor. Tattoo Man invited him to play cards. Lizard detected no distinction between those whose appearance earned them a living and those who depended on an unusual skill. And while the company prohibition of relations among workers curtailed blatant activity, he sensed some members of the troupe maintained liaisons all along. His only visit to a brothel, accompanying Tattoo and Anders, proved disastrous. The 7 women sitting in the parlor snickered when he arrived. 3 of them jumped up to surround Anders with his tall Swedish good looks. A small brunette woman sidled up to Tattoo, who was almost 50, but no one approached him. The madam flicked her head at a homely blonde with a mole above her right eye. Finally, the woman advanced, her sigh audible. Maybe she was new to the trade, he told himself as he stood there, waiting for her to touch him, to lead him by the hand, as the other women had done with his companions. Her eyes burned hot as white coals.
Follow me,
She said, her hands tight at her side. Once inside the tiny room with its bed shoved against the wall, she quickly closed the door.
This some sort of initiation ritual?
She asked. For who? He asked, arms dangling, groin aching at the possibility of a touch other than his own.
Me, for God's sake. Is this what Miss Martha does to all the new ones? Call you in here? If we can do you, we can do anything type of deal?
She sniffed her perfume, sweet like tea with too much sugar and no mint.
What's the matter? You don't talk?
She asked, still standing as far away as the room permitted. I've been talking all my life. I'm ready to rest now.
How much money you got?
$27.
I'll give you that much back if you let me alone. Please, mister, I'm real new to this.
You ain't much to look at either, not like them other girls.
I could talk to you real dirty, or maybe you could lie under a sheet and I could touch you through that.
You're worse than my father, pathetic drip of piss he was.
You did this kind of thing with him?
The color drained from her face. I'm not a monster, you little twat. Just not blessed with any more looks than you. He grabbed the door handle, the heat rising in his ears. The door banged open as he exploded into the hall, his stride swallowing the floor until he got out, pushing past the man who tried to intercept him at the front door. To hell with you and your ugly-ass whores, he spat as he reached the threshold. I'm going to buy me a drink. He realized he'd have to come back to meet up with Tattoo and Anders, but he wandered around for the better part of an hour. First the minutes ticking, his member drooping, the whore's disgust bitter and as bad moonshine on his tongue. Lizard stood at the edge of the agricultural exhibit hall, the vase emanating from the other side. Bass vase and alto bleeds, and so many in rapid succession. He wondered what was going on. It was early, barely 6, the sky bruised by the distant threat of rain. He scanned the building, raising his eyelids as if to chase the sleep still lingering there. In the far right corner, a corral of sheep huddled, baying at no one in particular. As he moved along the outskirts until he could see their faces, coal eyes set in black muzzles and white, following his movements as he neared. The rams penned in isolation across the room shifted, shooting their rat-a-tat bleats at him. Lizard stood his ground, edging closer to a ewe, her wool pressed against the side of the pen, nostrils flaring. She sniffed as he extended his hand. Slow as ice melting, Lizard unfurled his fingers and waited as she sniffed, her breath humid against his skin. Caught momentarily in the delicate grip of her mouth, the damp heat, the gentle bite of her teeth, her tongue traveling the shank of his thumb, tingles rose across the nape of his neck. Her jaw loosened and she began to lick his palm. Sensations the color of peach flesh rippled through him, orange gold, filling him like summer rain. She cocked her head as he squitched her wool, his fingers massaging her skin as they gravitated toward her rump. She bent over the rail and dropped his head. He bent over the rail and dropped his head so he could feel her wool beneath, brush his cheeks. He slid his hand around the slope of her belly to the warm teats. The expansion and contraction of her breath traveled up his arm into his chest until his own breathing matched hers. For a moment, time evaporated into that one stream of breath, short then long. That night, Lizard squatted by the fire, its flames biting the night sky. Tattoo and the strong man stood near him, roasting wieners on a stick. Lizard lifted the bottle of gin next to him and took a sip. You sure you don't want a wiener? Tattoo asked. Yeah, I'm sure. He nursed the gin and lit a cigarette instead. You get teased when you were a boy, the strong man? A fellow by the name of Tommy asked. What kind of question is that? Lizard demanded, his thighs beginning to burn. Just curious, I don't see where skin like that would be of much interest to people, but I figured young'uns would be apt to say something unkind. He felt the warmth of his early morning encounter flicker, then get swallowed into the center of the flame. You ever hear of Isaac? He said, his gaze trained on the fire. His daddy Abraham was prepared to sacrifice him to show his devotion to God. Dragged that boy up a mountain and drew his knife. The Lord let Abraham slay a ram instead. He didn't see Tommy roll his eyes at Tattoo. He just held an empty stick over the fire and let it drop, its shape mutating at the whim of flame. It's in Genesis, chapter 22. An angel appeared, called out to Abraham. Isaac's heart must have been pounding by this time. Bible never tells how he felt. How's that tying to you? Tattoo asked. Imagine being lashed down like that by your own father, Lizard drew on a cigarette. You better eat something, Lizard. That gin's gone straight to your head. Tommy held out a roasted wiener, impaled on a stick. Lizard stepped back, his heel wobbling as he shifted his weight. He shut his eyes and pictured the agricultural hall. The smell of the flock returned. I reckon there's a little bit of God lurking in every sheep. You sure you don't want something to eat? Tommy waved the wiener. Told you I'm not hungry. Maybe you better get some sleep, Tattoo smiled, the line of his lips hazy through the flame. Lizard flicked the butt of the cigarette into the fire and drained the last bit of gin. He felt the dribble slide down his chin over the lump in his throat. "Night, fellows," he mumbled as he staggered away, aching for the sound of God's voice, willing to settle for the touch of a kind-hearted whore. He fell across the bed in his darkened trailer, mumbling for long-gone Jessie, the sound of his own voice breaking, the scent of the yew lingering pale yellow in his hand.
The Midway Tabernacle of the Holy Metaphor. Had Earl Beasley Jr. encountered Greta in 1922 as he traveled the hollers and dusty roads in search of acts, he could not have imagined a figure so beguiling ever associating with the misfits and oddities he collected to put on display. Not that he would have been inclined, much less able, to board a steamer and cross the Atlantic, find his way to Berlin and gain entrance into the home of Ernst and Esther Gottlieb, whose beautiful only child would have appeared the epitome of perfection, willowy, with hair the color of afternoon sunlight falling across a bare root black gum, opal eyes cast downward to perfectly manicured hands resting in her lap. At age 12, she might have been persuaded by her parents to recite a poem by Chaim Bialik, possibly Rilke, both of whom would have been lost on Earl Beasley, who would not have recognized the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay or T.S. Eliot either. Though Earl thought he cut a suave figure in his charcoal serge suit and Florsheim shoes, literature, fine art, and what he called that
God-awful, highfalutin, every bit as bad as Tommy's Come to Jesus.
music held no interest.
I'm a businessman,
He was fond of saying.
with an eye for oddities, worth paying to see.
Had the Gottliebs met Earl Beasley at any point in life, they surely would have seen him to the door or excused themselves from his company. He had the unsophistication of an uneducated man who confused money with refinement and misconstrued profiting off the misfortune of others as benevolence. Nothing like Ernst, whose life of letters made him erudite beyond the inherent curiosity that fueled a career in journalism. First a writer, then an editor, he relished every aspect of working for a large daily paper. Esther had known him to slip out in the wee hours or wait to come home until after the type had been set and the great rolls of newsprint breathed out the day's events and commentary. Ernst read widely and thought deeply, a man of cognition, not emotion, who sought to improve the world by revealing truths as long as they did not cut close to home. Appearances mattered to Ernst Gottlieb, who, true to his surname, taken by his grandfather, considered himself a lover of God. He sought a practical piety that compelled tikkun olam, repair of the world, in the ways that aligned with one's natural talents. Unlike his brothers who became rabbis, he expressed his love of God through writing and reading the great works of others who crafted words as carefully as Elohim had wrought creation. When he married Esther Sorensen, he delighted in her beauty, elegant as the spray of white roses she carried out of the synagogue in London where they'd met when he had first traveled there on assignment to cover the Olympics in 1908. She, the daughter of a solicitor and a suffragette, read as voraciously as Ernst, and privately penned sonnets she never showed him despite his love of words. Though Esther preferred London to Berlin, Ernst's offer of a job writing for a large daily paper compelled her to leave. Once she gave birth to Greta in 1910, settling into the routine of motherhood and entertaining Ernst's literary associates, Berlin flowered for Esther, scenting her life with gardenia and Riesling. Raising Greta only added to the magnificence of the garden. Greta grew to be a lovely child, well-mannered, poised, often eager to please. As she stood beside the family piano singing, her voice the morning sun, an hour after sunrise, drenching the day in light. Quick in school and perpetually curious, she gobbled the words her father printed, perhaps her only indelicate act. The poetry she imbibed, the art songs she sang, the revelation she heard from a source beyond the cantor or rabbi, amalgamated into a core she came to rely on as the world came to play upon her its discordant chords. At 14, the first awareness comes. The girl 2 grades above her with long, dark chocolate tresses only Greta recognizes are not black, but the deepest of browns, smiles at her as if passing a note Greta continually unfolds. Over the course of the school term, the language of visual exchanges expands, notes of mutual desire uttered without words. The moments spent with Elizabeth, innocuous enough. A girlish hug held too long, fingertips grazing an arm, the stroke of a cheek moving a wisp of hair, cast rays bright enough to illumine even the grayest of Berlin skies. Yet the clouds gather, an impending storm in Greta's chest. Ernst and Esther notice the quietude that befalls her. Initially, they attribute her uncharacteristic taciturnity to adolescence, a time of such interiority that the inner murmurings fills a young person's head. Esther probes with occasional questions about school, and Ernst lures her with invitations to read antiphonally his treasured poems. But the drought continues in concert with the ever-darkening sky. Why, Elizabeth asks, do your words shrivel in the presence of such joy? No matter how fragrant the blossom, it grows in dung, Greta responds. As a Jew, Greta knows of the 6th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan as Shavuos, the festival of weeks, a harvest celebration, and the commemoration of God giving the Torah to his people assembled at Mount Sinai. A day she does not realize coincides with the Christian celebration of Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles in Jerusalem as they celebrated Shavuos. Nor does she know about Trinity Sunday in the Lutheran church Elizabeth's family attends. What she learns on the warm June day, Elizabeth invites her to come to church, promising there will be no repercussions for her tawny-haired Jewish friend, is that there, in that unfamiliar sanctuary, God finds her nonetheless. Between the Apostle Paul's exhortation in the epistle reading not to lust after evil things and the soprano singing, when I look into my conscience and see my account so full of defects, how can I escape from you, righteous God? Greta hears an admonition so deafening, she falls mute. God sees her misplaced yearning, unmoved by her prayers, laced with shame. As the lines of Bach's cantata unfurl, and if your conscience convicts you while you stand here mute, then look at the guarantor who cancels all debts. The blood of the Lamb, oh great love, has canceled your debt and reconciled you with God. Greta, convinced the blood of the Lamb doesn't reach her, vows never to touch Elizabeth again. They must rely only on notes penned or glances passed, nothing more. For Esther and Ernst, the silence becomes interminable, then terrifying. The experience of parenting a seemingly perfect child affords no preparation for a daughter suddenly mute. Greta refuses to speak to the rabbi or the handsome young psychoanalyst their physician recommends. In school she nods, forces the slenderest of smiles at her teachers as she hands in work, but no reprimand jars the words loose. If the adults in her life fray the edges of their worry, Elizabeth bears hers as a yoke. Though their caresses had been nothing more than fingertips grazing the softness of an inner arm, and would have raised no suspicion, Greta's resolve to forsake all physical contact does not weaken. Disconsolate, Elizabeth sings into the silence until finally Greta joins her. Shame commingled with relief, tears welling as her voice surfaces only in song. At home, Greta's parents rejoice at the first melodic sound accompanying the piano. "Oh, darling," Esther gushes. Yet the instant the music stops, the words vanish. Though she stitches a melody to the question, "My lovely daughter, why won't you speak?" Inviting Greta to sing back a reply, Greta simply leaves the room. Much as she wishes to comfort her mother, to lay a palm on her arm, she fears the imprint of desire on her fingertips will befoul Esther's skin. As her 16th birthday approaches, Ernst Ernst, bereft that the cable of connection wrought from words has collapsed in front of him, cries out to his God.
Restore my daughter.
He implores his brothers to pray, certain their piety will evoke an efficacy far beyond his. And yet Greta remains mute. Their lively exchanges and poetic recitations, a blight of memory, a boil rising on his skin. Realizing that their daughter will not gain entrance to university if she does not speak, nor will she marry, Esther and Ernst encourage her to sing. Greta, not given to burlesque, allows Elizabeth to introduce her to the music director at her church, who sees before him a budding Marlene Dietrich he can mold. It is there, at the great stone cathedral, that the American heiress, Constance Honeywell, settles into a middle pew to hear the young woman stirring music aficionados across Berlin. She delays her departure a fortnight so she can return to the church the next week. The second performance, even more glorious than the first, compels Constance Honeywell to wait at the exit and invite Greta to return to Boston with her. Daunted by nothing, Constance follows Greta home. Seated on the sofa in Ernst's extensive library, Constance recognizes the coup. Her beautiful songbird is a Jew. Now her offer extends far beyond luxurious accommodations and the opportunity to sing for Boston's Brahims in well-appointed concert halls. Her proposal provides an escape from the din of Nazis growing louder. Weeks before the first annual party conference in Nuremberg, Esther and Ernst consult the esteemed Leo Beck, president of the Rabbi Association, to ask his guidance. Do they hand their only child over to a woman they've just met? Who, unlike Earl Beasley, plans to carry her across an ocean, not simply drive across state lines in an American motorcar? It is Greta, writing feverishly on a note card, reminding her parents of last summer's invitation to sing at an event of Hitler Youth, that seals her fate. Within 3 weeks, she bids her family and Elizabeth farewell, boarding the SS Admiral Nakhimov in late September 1927 as Constance Honeywell clutches her hand. The grandeur of the foyer, the marble floors turning her footsteps into crisp percussion, the gilded mirrors reflecting back exhaustion lit to perfection, and the enormous vase of rhododendron stippled with roses, the petals white satin, elicit a sound. Constance turns to Greta. Darling, are you about to speak? Greta turns, her face glassine. The smile she offers, a whisper, but no words. By now, Greta finds the silence liberating. The chatter around her no longer magnifies her silence, it merely enrobes it. Great swaths of conversation fall about her shoulders, sometimes grazing her neck, occasionally resting in the hollow of her collarbone. There, the resonance of another's speech echoes a thought, a sensation welling within. In those instances, she slows herself enough to feel the vibration of sound permeating her throat, her vocal cords claiming external utterances as their own. Though it was the yearning for Elizabeth's touch that swallowed the words, that made even thoughts dangerous, Greta receives Constance's hand alighting on her forearm, even her cheek, without alarm. Whether it is distance or resignation, Greta accepts her touch in lieu of words, knowing there must be some currency of communication exchanged. Here there are no zealous youth thrusting arms into the air to punctuate Heil Hitler, no menacing glares, no hushed conversations between her parents or rabbinical uncles fearing the worst. Soon enough, financial prognostications will reach a fever pitch, but for now, the sound of Constance playing the flawless ivory and ebony keys of the Steinway in the grand living room with its brocade drapes and divan fills Greta's ears. Evenings she sings while Hollis Honeywell pores over papers in his study, bemused by the little girl his wife has brought home, alluring in her reticence. In time, he will find her as enchanting as his wife, seeking to bed them both. But for now, he remains content to listen to the music, to the singing, to the murmur of his wife's delight. As the months pass, the snow sighing on city streets, Greta and Constance visit concert halls and even grander living rooms, arranging performances throughout the Northeast. Not content to consign her protégé to a classical repertoire, Constance introduces Greta to the music of Gershwin and Copland, Ellington and Armstrong, Milhaud and Weill, immersing herself in this new world of jazz. The scat Greta sings, so delicious in her mouth, sates any atavistic longing to vocalize. The senseless syllables, a choreography of feeling actual words could never express. Upstairs in her room, decorated with floral hues to complement the hand-carved four-poster mahogany bed, Greta succumbs to Constance's charm, closing her eyes and then opening them to watch the impeccably manicured hands stroking her leg, fingertips circling her taut midriff, and finally the ruby lips latching. The absence of words transformed into an onomatopoeia of desire. What she denied herself and Elizabeth, she yields to Constance. So removed from Greta's context, their entwinement bears the quality of a dream, not the ignominy of sin. Accustomed to a feminine peck on the nape of her neck or the lightest squeeze of her hand, Greta finds ease in the day trips and overnights with Constance. Appreciative audiences sweeten the growing pleasure of singing, and occasional evenings spent in jazz clubs delight her. They travel to the Cotton Club in New York, Friars Inn in Chicago, and finally to the Mecca, New Orleans. The medley of humanity thrills her, the city as improvisational as the music it spawns. So removed from the climate and constraint of Berlin or Boston, she feels herself unbridled, her body an arabesque. Loath to leave, she implores Constance in her elliptical script to extend their stay. Atop the Pythian temple roof garden, Constance charms members of the black elite, while one of the band members slips Greta his calling card. The wink he offers elicits a rare smile. For a moment, Greta imagines a life here, spending evenings at Economy Hall or more intimate venues in Storyville, singing scat and dancing among people as varied as the voices she hears, Creole, Spanish, French, English, even German, with accents languorous and staccato. Drawn to the multiplicity of hues, Greta suddenly cannot imagine returning to the monochromatic existence she left in Berlin and largely experiences in Boston. By now, Ernst and Esther have listened to jazz recordings at Greta's urging, phonograph records assiduously packaged and posted at great expense by Constance, glad to keep the Gottliebs informed of their daughter's flourishing life. Greta has become more than a fixture in the Honeywell household. She reigns as the orienting star Constance orbits and Hollis tracks. Their attention exhausts her, singular in direction. Greta begins to feel more like a showgirl than a songbird housed in a gilded cage. September 1928, a year after she and Constance set sail for Boston, Greta knows she must leave. By now she travels freely through Boston, though moments alone come rarely, and she seizes the first chance to slip out, ostensibly to return to a dressmaker for a fitting. She collects a few belongings, tucks them into a valise, and scurries out the front door. The lack of a note feels impolite, but any expression of gratitude will signal her departure. She does not wish to be followed or found. At South Station, she purchases a ticket for New Orleans, pressing a neatly printed card with her designation toward the clerk. Pacing as she waits for the train to depart, she hums Old Man River, summoning Paul Robeson's baritone to sweep the heaviness gathered in her chest from the night before. When Hollis entered her bedroom, she in her nightgown, he in his robe, taking her face in his hands. Greta smiled as she shook her head no. It wasn't the kiss light on her lips, but his grin as he backs out of the room that determines her departure date. The train whistle startles. The Pullman porter takes her bag, and before her body registers it, she hurtles south. In New York, she changes trains, boarding the Crescent that runs through Washington, Atlanta, and Montgomery before reaching New Orleans the next day. The engineer on the Crescent will swear later he never saw the cow. In the 7 years he's worked the route, no bovines have interfered, though several times they've wandered within view. Shortly after crossing into Alabama, the train collides, the cow catcher failing to divert the animal off the track. Part of the flank and leg bone jam the truck right as the track curves, derailing the engine and the first car. It will be hours before the track gets cleared and the passengers on the Crescent resume travel. As the dusk purples the sky, Greta, rattled and restless, steps off the train, valise in hand, striding toward a crossing she somehow anticipates. Jelly Roll Morton's Sunday Sweetheart in her head. She reaches the road and turns left just as Sven Anders bears right in the 1925 Ford pickup, touting Kimball's Traveling Emporium on both doors.
Evening, ma'am.
He offers out the window.
Can I offer you a ride?
The blonde Swede looks familiar, a taller version of the sweet-faced Hitler Youth she remembers from Berlin. Benign in his overalls and dusty work cap, a smile glooming to reveal the tooth slightly chipped from a sword handle jiggled by an unexpected cough. Greta nods to the lanky gent who quickly hops out, helps her in, then removes his clean cambray shirt to wrap around her small case before setting it on the bed of the truck. She can't help but notice the broad chest, the muscled arms, the single tattoo on his right deltoid, tiny, unfolding in Edwardian script. She has never sat beside a man in his undershirt, nor one so obviously comfortable with himself in such an unassuming way. For a moment she yearns to speak, to ask who he is, where he's going, and whether he likes jazz. But the words remain tucked inside, caught beneath the lack of longing for his perfect physique. The confirmation so clear it mutes her again. Sven Anders is no more interested in the elegant creature before him than she is in him. He longs only to see Tiny Laveau. That once in 7 years, Kimball's Traveling Emporium arrives the evening before Boylep Day for Beasley's Traveling Amusements, bestows a measure of good fortune the affable sword swallower cannot fathom. Each show, with its own turf and tenor, follows a circuit dependent on the same rail lines and fairgrounds, careful not to overlap or saturate the market of weary farmers, curious tradesmen, housewives, and youngsters, all eager for entertainment. Recognizing that the beautifully bedraggled young woman next to him will need lodging for the night, he drives to the only safe place he knows, off in Newsom, Alabama, with actual beds and clean sheets. A brothel run by Jean Delacroix out of an 8-room residence that once belonged to a minor tycoon embroiled in a scandal eager to offload his house.
This here is not strictly for lodging.
Anders offers as he pulls up in front of the row of crepe-myrtled Miss Jean planted to ensure discretion.
But it's the only place fit for a lady, even if it is Saturday night.
Anders doffs his cap as he enters the bordello behind Greta.
Evening, Miss Jean.
Why, Sven, it's been a while.
Yes, it has. I'm hoping to run into Tiny before Beasley's hits the rails Monday, so I'm not here on business. I found this young lady walking along the tracks, and I thought maybe...
I could use a pretty girl as that.
No, ma'am, Miss Greta here.
He lowered his voice.
Don't talk. This here's her card.
Greta Gottlieb, vocalist par excellence, Honeywell Estate, 4 Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts. Well, honey, you're a long way from home. Do tell, what's a fancy girl like you doing in a place like this? Anders eyes the pen and pad on the hall table and hands it to Greta, who writes, "Going to New Orleans." Well, soon as Sally finishes up in room 6, we'll get you some fresh sheets and a place to sleep. Breakfast on Sundays at 8, though some girls don't wander down till 10. Anders wastes no time in leaving, anxious to get over to the far edge of the fairgrounds to catch Martha, one of the Beasley's cooks, before she turns in for the night. She's his one chance to get word to Tiny, to meet him on Sunday at the only restaurant in Newsom, down the road from Grossman's Mercantile and the feed store. Maybe after they meet up and eat, Miss Jean will let them use one of her rooms. Greta sleeps fitfully. Alone with the stark truth, her affections constantly displease God. If it had been only Elizabeth, the passing fancy of schoolgirls, or acquiescing to the charms of Constance. But no, in that house full of women so willing to service men, far coarser than Hollis Honeywell, she knew nature had forsaken her, setting her irredeemably apart. The derailed train, a sign that she, like Cain, would be left to wander, her muteness the mark she set upon herself. The song's a feeble attempt not to lose the last remaining filament of connection to God. Obadiah McEnroe had been sitting in the fourth car on the Crescent when the train collided with the cow. Initially aggravated by the delay, he soon realized the Lord's mysterious ways. Already a day behind his traveling schedule in order to get to New Orleans for the big revival Tuesday night, Obadiah would have to skip the stop in Newsom, a God-forsaken place filled with carnival freaks so full of the devil the Almighty had marked them with fins and fur, scales and blubber. A revival preacher with his gifts had no reason to waste even a single Sunday at such a sorry outpost, even if the patrons of the fairgrounds were ripe for salvation. Hadn't been all that far from Newsom that he'd encountered the first of God's hellish minions, a small boy scaled like a serpent, wearing angel wings, prophesying on a street corner in Montgomery, just 2 blocks from where he stood on a soapbox testifying to the powers of the Lord. Obadiah, with his 6-foot frame and pearly skin, clearly a physical specimen meant to display God's favor, devoted his life from the age of 16 to bringing souls to Jesus. Why anyone flocked to that unholy child with his wretched skin, worse than any leper Jesus might heal, befuddled him. Blaspheming the Lord by spouting Bible verses he clearly knew nothing about, offering assurances to broad-faced women folk beset with grief, or misgivings only a real preacher could tame. That's when Obadiah understood freaks as nothing but evil. And now he could see that God, in his infinite mercy, sacrificed that cow in the grate of a fast-moving train to spare him a stop where the taint of Satan would surely throw his revival off track. Little matter that the local fellow charged with setting up the tent and sign had no idea the preacher would skip town. Let the oddities congregate without him. Left to face the deformities God levied Left to face the deformities God levied to forever match their sin-sick souls. Word spreads faster than lice about a tented temple less than a mile beyond the fairgrounds. Half-sheet flyers appeared announcing a 10 a.m. service on that boiling day. The geek hands Lizard Man the fractured paper, creased and oiled by many hands, pops a peppermint into his mouth. Lizard crumples the flyer, tossing the ball back.
Why don't you eat this crap while you're at it? Nothing so desperate as people peddling lies to people more desperate than they are. Chew.
Seen enough of that, have you? Lizard repeats the sound.
Chew.
If he had the mighty tail pictured over the Midway, he would flick it. The horsefly of memory landing hard. The angel-winged little boy on the edge of Main Street, doling out dollops of hope to stout women tucked into corsets, bending over to receive God's message from the smooth lips of an otherwise puckered, fake emissary of the Lord.
If there's any kind of God at all, why the hell would he make a man to be so lonely?
The geek knows the answer, though he says nothing. It is the lonely who, in their turning toward God, stave off God's loneliness. It appears a mirage at first, the clay dust rising in a holy wind around the open-sided tent, folding chairs arranged in a circle as if the Ark of the Covenant hides in the center. Anders peers down the alley across the previously empty lot where the tent stands 20 feet beyond the painted wooden sign that reads, Midway Tabernacle, where someone has written beneath, of the Holy Metaphor.
What the hell is that, Tiny?
She cranes her neck up at the 6-foot Swede. A tent, Anders. It's just a sideless tent.
No, babe, the hand-wrote part.
Tiny loves him for his looks, but more for the way he lifts her, half his height, so she can gaze into his glacial blue eyes, nose to nose. A metaphor is a fancy word for a fancy word that means something you can't know straight on, so you compare it to something solid. Love is a full moon rising orange in an indigo sky.
How the hell you learn to talk like that, Tiny?
Same way you learn to swallow swords. Practice. I read. What else would I do? What else could I reach beside a stack of books next to my pallet on the floor?
I would have built you a set of teeny shelves.
That's why I love you, darling. He slips her onto his shoulders, holding her ankles steady so she can admire the sign.
What makes a metaphor holy?
Nobody but Moses got a glimpse of God, and that was only the backside. Christians never really see Jesus except for their illustrated Bibles and made-up pictures. I hear the Hindus got elephant gods. So if everyone's got their version of what God looks like, sounds like, acts like, they got to find a way to make it all plain. So I reckon a holy metaphor is just a way to finger paint God. In Miss Jean's house, at a treacly scented table, women cast as Jezebels bellow full-throated laughs, mouths agape, heads tipped back as if gulping delight. How, Greta longs to know, can they summon such pleasure at breakfast when by noon their licentiousness will defile them in the eyes of their Maker? Perhaps they are not religious or worship some other god. Could the blood of the Lamb cancel their debt? Could there be enough blood to cleanse them daily, reconciling them no matter how often they sully themselves? She has never seen women so free, able to leave a house defined by the passage of men, who choose instead to remain in an edifice devoid of books or art, an ode to carnality without pretense or regret. Unsettled, she steps out in her blue satin shoes dyed to match her dress, one of two she packed to catch the eye of a band leader in Economy Hall. The canopy of the tent at the end of the road draws her, reminiscent of the tabernacle her forebears assembled a millennia ago. The notes of the Bach cantata fill her until she must give them voice. Eyes closed, sound magnified by the lack of visual distraction, each word forms a prayer of contrition, a yearning to return to Elohim's embrace. The geek notices her immediately at the back of the tabernacle, her dress an oceanic hue he glimpsed on a picture postcard, her legs long, arms slender. She returns no gaze, appearing transfixed, eyelids fluttering, her short bobbed hair the color of red oak split and polished to a sheen. The sound begins as a purring deep in her throat, becoming silver strewn across a cerulean sky. Syllables indistinguishable in their unfamiliarity penetrate his chest. His inhalation slow, her song filling his lungs. He savors its presence, reluctant to exhale. The notes fill him in a way both reassuring and terrifying, for he has never felt this way before. Known. Though the geek never cottoned to Lizard, nobody does. He must get him to come. The geek has never met a more tortured fellow, not even in prison, not even old Sam Kennedy, who hovered like a haint on death row. Lizard's own internal cage binds him tighter than Isaac lashed to the rock, and though the geek has seen Lizard moving among the sheep in the agricultural exhibit, he can tell no ram of God has come to save him. The geek bangs Lizard's trailer, insistent.
Why the hell should I go?
Because her voice will split you down the center sure as lightning cleaves a tree.
Why would I want to be split down the middle? Scorched even.
The geek knows no better than to tell him her voice might just have the power to break the cage Lizard spent his days and nights thrashing in. She's prettier than daybreak over a new-mown field, and I am telling you, man, how she sings is right as rain.
Told you the first time we met, I got no use for Jesus.
She don't sing them kind of songs. Ain't nothing about the blood or the lamb or the burden of the cross.
I got no use for God's salvation. All we got to do is forsake our sins and give our cares to Jesus, and he'll wipe them all away. That's horseshit, and I'm living proof. Folks like my mother believe so hard they break a sweat, then swear they got holy water coming out of their pores, when it ain't nothing but the brine we stew in.
No wonder you ain't never been laid, Lizard. You ain't got spit in the corner of your mouth. It's bile.
That's rich coming from a man who bites the head off a live chicken.
Hell, I slit a man's throat. I can be one nasty critter worse than a pack of raccoons under a porch. I spent 30 years in a cell the size of your display booth, but I ain't blaming Jesus or Big Daddy God or even that poor sod Joseph who didn't get to lay with his girl. Had to step aside for the Lord to have her instead.
Nothing in the scriptures about God fornicating with Mary.
Well, don't that make you godly then, Lizard? You and the Lord. Lord, no mention of fornicating.
Shut your ugly ass mouth, Arnold.
My name ain't Arnold.
No, but it's a name of another sorry ass pecker reminds me of you. Now leave me be. I gotta get rested today. I gotta go back on display.
I'm telling you, man, you need to escape this place. Damn it, Lizard, get you a few minutes sweet relief from the sorry confines of that tortured soul you haul around. Just come on now. If you don't like it, leave. And if you do, buy me a beer to thank me.
I'm not promising.
I ain't asking you for my sake, Lizard. I'm just telling you, you'll be a changed man.
Well, don't start with that crap. If Jesus were gonna drop these scales, he would have done so long time ago.
I don't know that holy book backwards and sideways like you do. But I could swear the only scales he made fall were on some fellow's eyes. Because he isn't up 30 cents in a Sunday morning card game, Lizard grabs his hat, felt Vidoria, gray as rain-soaked sky with a black band smooth against his forehead, and follows the geek out of the fairgrounds without saying a word. The space where the flaps don't hang slow, his breathing. Geek didn't lie. It doesn't look like a church at all, just a tent top without roofs. No acrid smell of anticipation, no titters or chortling. Quiet for a moment. The hush before the wind picks up and dust coats a man's shoes like cornmeal. His left eye twitches. Deep in his trouser pocket, he clenches his fist, bracing for the onslaught of agony. Stout women clucking over him on the street corner. The willowy man with the dark brown hat pleading to save his child and then returning later to ask if she were with Jesus now. He turns to go, slinking out the way he slunk in. And then he hears her as she begins to sing. The first several notes, the silk of Jesse's fur against his fingertips, the palms of his hands, the soles of his feet, landing so provocatively he has to close his eyes. The pale yellow of the ewe's wool fills his bald hand. His panting commences as drizzle progressing to rain. Mouth open, lips dry, he breathes the sound deeper into his body, chest, belly, loins, tightening and releasing in a way so unnerving he checks his fly, thankfully flat and dry. But if it isn't that, what is it causing the shudder that mesmerizes him? The air changes in the tent, electrifies. The notes are no longer hers alone, now taken in and given back. This she knows, she feels as she sings, yet she cannot open her eyes. Elohim, Elohim, have you come for me? The words rising, cresting in her body. I was standing by the banks, by the river, looking out over life's troubled seas, when I saw an old ship that was sailing. Is that the old ship of Zion I see? Its hull was bent and battered from the storms of life. I could see waves were rough, but the old ship kept sailing. Is that the old ship of Zion I see? At the stern of the ship was the captain. I could hear as he called out my name. Get on board the old ship of Zion. It will never pass this way again. all my sorrows and trials behind. I'll be safe with Jesus, the captain, sailing on the old ship of Zion. Though she had never heard it before, the hymn fills Greta as she has never been filled, not by Bach or scat, nor the Hebrew melodies of home. The wave of voices breaks her open. Elohim, Elohim, you have come. She turns to face the choir behind her, moving into the middle of the space, beckoning, each one forming the circle, except for the man standing alone at the edge of the tent, watching as she approaches, trembling as she takes his hand, skin smooth against skin, his palm pressed into hers, body awakened. Julian Henry weeps. Greta places her arm around him, guiding him to the center as the congregation reprises the hymn. As I'm standing by the banks, by the river, looking out over life's troubled seas, when I saw an old ship that was sailing